All right, folks, welcome back to our student interview series here at Knowable World, where we're showing you what our students can do. And our topic now is Japanese history, and I have Ava with me, who is an upper elementary student. And so we're going to talk about Japan. And we begin where we always begin, Ava, in Knowable World, which is with the context for studying the story of any particular culture. That means the whole world. How do we capture that before we dive into any particular topic? What is this world we live in?
The world we live in is an interconnected agglomeration of nearly 200 countries, organized into 10 major cultural blocks, mainly controlled by 5 cardinal cultures, in which the United States has primacy.
Excellent. All right, so where does Japan fit in that big picture? Which one is Japan?
Japan is a major culture.
Major culture. Okay, so it's not one of those cardinal cultures. What's the difference? What makes Japan merely a major culture?
Japan has a decrease in its population.
All right, so the population of Japan is shrinking. That's definitely an important clue. Why is the population of Japan shrinking?
Because people are having less babies.
Okay, that's definitely an important one. And there's something else about Japan, which is that, well, Americans aren't having that many babies, in fact. And a lot of countries, in fact, are having fewer and fewer babies these days. But America's population is still growing. So what's the difference? Why do some countries that are having fewer and fewer babies still have way more people all the time, whereas Japan doesn't?
Because Japan is insular, which means they are isolated by choice.
Isolated by choice. And so how does that affect the population? Because America has a lot of what that Japan doesn't have?
The United States has a lot more immigrants.
Okay, that's the one, right? And Japan does not because it's insular, isolated by choice. Good. So, and that insularity, we're going to learn the roots of that today. But that would not be the defining trait of Japan today. Certainly an ingredient. So what would be the, as we say, the defining aspect of Japan's culture today?
Japan is post-imperial.
Japan is post-imperial. Okay, can you elaborate a little bit on what that means? What is a post-imperial culture?
Post-imperial means they used to want to take control over the world and other countries, but now they don't, and they really don't know what they are. They're just living their life.
Yeah, it's pretty good, right? They're just kind of going along. There's nothing wrong with life in Japan, I must say, right? Very high-tech country, very economically important. Life there is actually very good, but on the other hand, there's a lack of energy. There's a lack of dynamism, and so, yeah, it's a post-imperial culture. All right, so of course, we're going to have to dig into that history and find where was the imperial phase. Okay, but before we get to that, we're going to do what we always do, which is we dive right back into the ancient past, because people don't often grasp this aspect of history, which is that the ancient past almost always has a big hold on us. So that's where we're going to go next. Okay, Ava, so let's go all the way back to the origin story, which of course always matters, right? When we have superheroes and supervillains, boy, we need to know that origin story. All right, so what is the Japanese culture's origin story, please?
Japan started circa 660 BC, when the sun goddess Amaterasu gave birth to the first emperor of Japan, Jimmu, and he was considered divine, because if you were born from a goddess, you were divine.
Nice, right? Okay, so this is in what Japanese, let's call it religion?
Shintoism.
Shintoism. Okay, good. So the Japanese have this belief that the Emperor Jimmu was born from the sun goddess. Okay. Is that the sun goddess for the whole universe? Well, I guess, okay, at least for our solar system.
Just for Japan.
Interesting, right? Just for Japan,
Yeah.
right? The Japanese gods are of, by, and for Japan only. We're going to come back to that too. Okay. So this gave him, as you said, a divine quality. And there's a long story of Japan, and we don't, in Knowable World, we don't like to get bogged down in the details. But what we do know about Japanese history is that Jima was the first in a long line of kings. It's called the Yamato dynasty. And what's special about that? In other words, how many dynasties were there?
There was just one dynasty.
There was just one, all the way to this day, as it turns out, which is amazing because, as you said, circa 660 BC to now, that's 2,700 years of one family ruling a country. So clearly the Japanese believe in this. Otherwise, that wouldn't work. Okay. But if you have divine emperors, they're not allowed to get their hands dirty. How did the Japanese divine emperors manage to do all the dirty work that still has to be done to truly organize a kingdom?
They had shogun, which are people who basically did the dirty work for them, or they say the emperor had an idea, the shogun put it into action.
Okay, just because the emperor was divine didn't mean that everybody was always going to behave. So yeah, the shogun sometimes had to bring back order. And so we have this long, ancient, and medieval history of Japan that we cover a few aspects of that, but not terribly much, right? Because modern Japan does not have shoguns anymore. It still has an emperor, but in a very different way. We'll get to that. So why is modern Japan different? What happened? That's one of our anchor facts, as we like to say in Knowable World, that changed ancient Japan into modern Japan.
1543/9, when merchants and missionaries came to Japan. The merchants were people who wanted to trade, and the missionaries were people who wanted to convert them to a different religion. In this case, Christianity.
Yeah, and okay, now that's going to be a big deal, right? Because the Japanese believe in many gods like Amaterasu. Okay, how about the Christians?
They only believe in one God.
One God. All right, so their message to the Japanese concerning their gods was what?
They don't matter.
Yeah, well, even they don't exist. They're not real. You might believe in them, but they're not real any more than the Egyptian gods or the ancient Greek gods like Zeus or Apollo, right? I mean, those are obsolete. Okay, so that's just a matter of opinion. That's a difference of religious belief. But this mattered much more to the Japanese, right? Because of what you said about the emperors. So this religious difference was actually a threat to the emperors. How?
Because if they didn't believe in Shintoism, the emperor was not divine.
Aha, so he's just some other guy, and you can rebel and replace him. All right, so that's going to be a problem. Okay, so what historical event really dramatizes this reality of the incompatibility of Christianity and Shintoism?
1637, the Shimabara Rebellion, when a clan leader was converted to Christianity, and so were thousands of other people.
Okay, and as you said, it's called a rebellion. So what happened?
A lot of people died.
Okay, well, yeah, so they rebelled, and of course, who took care of the dirty business?
The shogun.
The shogun eliminated everybody in Shimabara. And then after that, Japan implemented its insular policy, but we like to use the Japanese word, which is what?
Sakoku policy.
Sakoku policy. Okay, that meant what?
That meant they were completely separated by the world by choice.
Okay. And so if you were a European merchant, you were allowed to go to one port, as it turns out, Nagasaki. But if you were found wandering around anywhere else in Japan, what happened to you?
You were killed.
Yeah, right on the spot by one of the samurai. Okay, so this was a no-nonsense policy. All right, so Japan wanted to stay isolated. So, but Japan is not isolated anymore, certainly not in that way. So, how did the transformation come about?
1853/4, when Commodore Perry came to Japan, wanting to break the Sakoku policy.
Break the Sakoku policy, right. So, Commodore Perry was an American. Okay. And he told the Japanese, listen, globalization is happening, whether you like it or not, and we can't have you slaughtering American sailors if they are shipwrecked in Japan. We need access to coal when our ships are headed for China, for instance. You have got to change your ways. Japanese didn't like that, but why did they accept it?
Because Commodore Perry used gunboat diplomacy, which meant he pointed their guns at them and told them to talk.
Yeah, right. Very good. Right. Diplomacy is normally talking. Gunboat diplomacy is pointing a gun at somebody and saying, talk. All right. And so the result was the Treaty of Kanagawa, and Japan basically gave in, but they were not happy. We know that about them. They didn't want it. So how did they react?
They started imperialism and they wanted to start an empire. So what they did was they wanted to start an empire mainly focusing on militarization and industrialization.
Okay,
And they started doing that by taking over Korea.
Yeah, okay. Poor Korea, sandwiched in between China and Japan. And so Japan started to take over Korea. They got into a bunch of fights and they were winning them because they were really modernizing, as you said, industrializing. So they kind of got it in their heads that that was the way to do it. How does a culture that wants to be isolated embrace imperialism? How do we square that circle?
Japan wanted to boss around Korea because
Okay.
because America bossed around them.
Okay, right. So they were looking at that and saying, there's only two ways to do things. Either somebody else bosses you around, or you boss somebody else around. And so that was sad. I mean, that was a lesson. Unfortunately, they learned that from Europe and America. It wasn't a good lesson to learn, but that was how they chose to interpret history, and that's what they went about doing. Okay, so where does that bring us in our anchor fact telling of Japanese history? What did Japan do at the end of this story of reactionary imperialism, as we like to call it?
So Japan was almost completely done taking over Korea, but then at the end of World War II in Asia, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan.
Okay, and so Japan was completely defeated, surrendered unconditionally, and that's the main reason why we talk about Japan as being post-imperial today. But then we have this guy called Douglas MacArthur, and he imposed a new constitution on Japan. What's the most important thing that it says in that constitution?
No wage on war.
No waging of war. It says we renounce war. There's one other interesting feature of it. It also says that the emperor is a symbol of Japan, but he's not going to have power anymore. Japan's going to become more democratic like Western countries. And so has Japan kept its promise?
Yes, they've kept their promise. Pretty much.
Okay, so we've got a post-imperial culture, and it's kept its promise ever since World War II. That's looking pretty good. It's a peaceful member of the America-centric world order. Any thoughts about Japan's future? What do things look like? What might we expect based on our studies of history this year?
China still has a grudge on Japan.
Okay, so how might we see that play out? Well, China is a cardinal culture. And what kind of China do we have?
Post-Maoist pirate.
Okay, so they're very much trying to become the Middle Kingdom again. Japan stands in the way. History doesn't usually like arrangements like that, but what makes Japan fairly safe?
America makes them safe.
Yeah, America makes them safe, basically. So, yeah, it's hard to predict what's going to happen. And, yeah, so Japan is an interesting culture to study. It once was a cardinal culture in the world wars, but it basically has settled into a relatively benign existence, so that's a good thing. And we can all enjoy sushi, and if we want to get some exercise, we can do some karate or judo, and we don't have to get involved in any wars with Japan anymore. Okay, so thank you, Ava, for this survey of Japanese history via the Anchor Facts. And hopefully we'll see you again in another interview at some point, all right?
Thank you. Bye.